Listen closely. It's a sound that crawls up your spine before it even hits your ears. A low, guttural moan. The sound of high-tensile steel stretching to its absolute breaking point under the weight of the abyss. It's the sound of 5,000 tons of freezing salt water pressing against a skin thinner than the sole of your boot. In the dark, cramped berths of a ship at sea, this groan isn't just background noise. It's a reminder. In the naval shipyards of the 1940s, they had a nickname for the destroyer: the Tin Can. It wasn't an affectionate term born of camaraderie. It was a cold, hard description of a terrifying engineering reality. While the gargantuan battleships of the era were wrapped in 18 inches of case-hardened armor plate, steel designed to shrug off the heaviest shells ever forged, the destroyer had nothing. No armor, no protection. Just a quarter-inch of mild steel separating 300 sailors from the crushing black depths of the ocean. Imagine standing in a compartment where the air is thick with the smell of diesel and unwashed bodies. The walls are vibrating with the violent rhythm of two massive steam turbines pushing the hull through the swells at 35 knots. You are surrounded by high-pressure steam lines, depth charges, and thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. And between you and a watery grave is a sheet of metal so thin that a stray burst from a 20-millimeter cannon could zipper it open like a piece of parchment. In our history, these ships were the workhorses of the fleet, but they were never designed to stand alone against a superior technological nightmare. But in the timeline we are exploring today, that vulnerability wasn't just a calculated risk. It became a catastrophic flaw. This isn't the heroic voyage you've read about in history books. This isn't a tale of triumphant escorts and celebrated victories. This is a journey into a floating coffin. A look at an alternative history where the ocean became a graveyard of unprecedented scale. In this world, the destroyer was the central theme of a global tragedy. It was the quarter-inch shield, a vessel designed for speed and utility, suddenly thrust into a naval war that had evolved into something far more predatory and unforgiving than anyone anticipated. As the Axis powers perfected new ways to pierce that thin skin, the men of the destroyer fleet found themselves trapped in a terrifying paradox. They were the primary defenders of the free world, yet they were the most fragile pieces on the board. The sound of the hull groaning wasn't just the movement of the sea. It was the sound of a countdown. Because in this timeline, when the ocean finally decided to come inside, there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that a quarter-inch of steel could do to stop it. The era of the tin can was about to transform from a tactical necessity into a psychological horror, as the hunters of the deep found a way to turn the destroyer's own strengths against it. To understand how the world fell apart, we have to look at the ships that were supposed to hold it together. To understand the tragedy of our alternate timeline, we must first look at the triumph of our own. In the real history of World War II, the destroyer was the undisputed sentinel of the seas. They were the greyhounds, sleek, fast, and bristling with weaponry. They were the ships that did the work no one else wanted to do, and they did it with a ferocity that defied their small stature. In our world, the American Fletcher class was the gold standard of this philosophy. A 2,100-ton masterpiece of utility, the Fletcher was the backbone of the United States Navy. It carried 5 5-inch guns that could fire at surface targets or into the sky, 10 torpedo tubes for taking on larger prey, and a suite of anti-aircraft batteries that turned the ship into a floating hedgehog of fire. Across the Atlantic, the British Tribal-class destroyers played a similar role. Heavy, gun-focused brawlers designed to hunt down enemy surface raiders and keep the vital lifelines to North America open. These ships were the workhorses in every sense of the word. If a task was too dangerous for a merchant ship and too small for a battleship, it fell to the tin cans. They were the eyes and ears of the fleet. They hunted the U-boats that stalked the convoys. They screened the massive aircraft carriers from kamikaze attacks. They stood as the first line of defense against the terrifying night-fighting tactics of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In our reality, the destroyer was the predator. Equipped with early sonar, known as Acoustic by the British, these ships could hear the enemy beneath the waves. They would pin a submarine down, circle it like a pack of wolves, and drop depth charges until the pressure crushed the enemy's hull. For most of the war, if you were a sailor on a destroyer, you were the shield. You were the reason the supplies reached London and the reason the Marines reached the beaches of Okinawa. The thinness of your hull was a trade-off you accepted because your speed and your sensors made you the master of the engagement. But this role, this essential heroic duty, rested on a single fragile assumption: that the destroyer could detect the threat before the threat could strike. In our history, the Allies managed to stay just one step ahead in the technological arms race. Radar, improved sonar, and the Foxer noise-making decoys kept the tin cans safe enough to do their jobs. We remember them as the victors because in our timeline, the shield held. But history is a series of ifs, and the margin for error was razor thin. In the timeline we are exploring today, the Axis powers didn't just catch up, they surged ahead. They looked at the destroyer, the loudest, fastest, most essential ship in the Allied fleet, and they stopped seeing a hunter. They started seeing a target. A technological breakthrough was about to occur in the laboratories of the Third Reich, one that would turn the destroyer's greatest asset, its powerful, churning engines, into a death sentence. The math of naval warfare was about to be rewritten in blood, and the quarter-inch shield was about to face a nightmare it was never designed to survive. The Divergence begins in the cold, salt-sprayed laboratories of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. In our timeline, the German Kriegsmarine introduced the T5 Sonnenkönig acoustic torpedo in the autumn of 1943. It was a terrifying weapon, but it arrived late, and the Allies quickly developed Foxer decoys. Simple metal pipes rattled together behind a ship to confuse the torpedo's primitive ears. But in this darker reality, the breakthrough happens a full year earlier. By December 1942, the German industrial machine has not only perfected the acoustic seeker, but has hardened its sensors against interference. This is the acoustic nightmare. The T5 wasn't just a torpedo, it was a robotic predator. Once launched into the general vicinity of a convoy, its internal microphones would scan the water for the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of a ship's propellers. In our world, a destroyer captain could drop a Foxer decoy and breathe a sigh of relief as the torpedo veered off harmlessly into the empty wake. In this timeline, the upgraded Sonnenkönig ignores the high-pitched clatter of the decoys. It filters out the noise. It listens specifically for the deep, powerful cavitation of high-speed turbine engines. And no ship in the fleet is louder than a destroyer. The irony is cruel. To hunt a submarine, a destroyer must move fast. It must use its speed to localize a contact and drop its depth charges before the U-boat can slip away. But in this world, every revolution of the propeller is a beacon. The very act of hunting now broadcasts the destroyer's exact position to a weapon that cannot be outrun. The tin can, once the most feared adversary of the U-boat, has suddenly become the most vulnerable. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic is instantaneous and catastrophic. In a single week in early 1943, the escort screens of 3 major convoys are wiped out not by conventional wolf pack tactics, but by sniper shots from the deep. The U-boats no longer aim for the slow, lumbering tankers in the middle of the pack. They target the destroyers on the perimeter first. They strip the convoy of its protection, one acoustic signature at a time. The psychological shift is devastating. For the crews of these ships, the mission has fundamentally changed. They are no longer the sentinels of the sea. They are the bait. High Command continues to send them out, knowing that their presence is the only thing keeping the merchant ships afloat, but the survival rates plummet. The term escort duty is quietly replaced in the mess halls with a more honest description: a suicide mission. Every sailor on board knows the truth. They are trapped in a vibrating steel box, surrounded by the loudest machinery on the ocean, in a sea filled with ears that are listening for their death knell. The quarter-inch of steel between them and the abyss has never felt thinner. And as the losses mount, the men inside these ships begin to change. They are entering a world of sensory deprivation and constant, grinding terror, where the sound of their own ship's heart is the very thing that will lead the enemy to their door. Step inside the hull. If the Atlantic is a graveyard, the interior of a Fletcher-class destroyer in this timeline is its most claustrophobic tomb. To understand the terror of the acoustic torpedo, you have to understand the environment it targets. This is the iron Sweatbox. Designed to hold roughly 150 men, the urgent need for more anti-aircraft crews, more damage control teams, and more lookouts has bloated the crew to over 300. The ship is physically bursting at the seams. In the berthing compartments, hot bunking has become a grueling necessity. When one man rolls out of his cot to take his watch, another crawls in immediately, the canvas still damp and warm with the previous man's sweat. There is no private space. There is only the collective struggle to exist in a world of gray steel. The air below decks is a thick, humid soup. It is a nauseating cocktail of unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, and the omnipresent, oily stench of No. 2 diesel fuel. It seeps into your skin, your hair, and the very bread you eat. You don't just smell the ship, you wear it. And then there is the vibration. The twin turbines are never silent. They hum through the soles of your boots and rattle the fillings in your teeth. In our world, that hum was the sound of power. In this timeline, it is a countdown. Every revolution of the propeller shaft is a signal flare sent into the depths, a rhythmic invitation for a Zonkönig to find its mark. To the men in the engine room, 30 feet below the waterline, the vibration is a physical weight. They work in 120-degree heat, surrounded by high-pressure steam pipes that could burst with the slightest shimmy of the hull. They know that if a torpedo strikes, they will be the first to go, likely never even seeing the water that drowns them. They live in a state of permanent, low-grade cardiac arrest, their ears tuned not to the orders of their officers, but to any change in the mechanical pitch of the ship. On the mess decks, you see the result: the destroyer stare. It is the look of a man who hasn't had more than 4 hours of interrupted sleep in a month. Their eyes are red-rimmed from salt and fatigue, fixed on the bulkheads as if they can see through the quarter-inch steel to the dark, freezing water beyond. They aren't looking for the enemy. They are listening. Every clatter of a dropped wrench or the sudden thud of a heavy sea against the bow sends a jolt of adrenaline through the crew that never quite fades. This level of exhaustion is a silent killer. It creates a friction between human endurance and mechanical survival. On the bridge and in the sonar shack, the edge is gone. The pings of the ASDIC begin to blur into the background noise of the ocean. The lookouts, their eyes burning from scanning the horizon through freezing spray and moonless nights, start to see ghosts in the mist. A tired mind misses a shadow on the waves. A sleep-deprived hand hesitates on a depth charge release. This collective fatigue is the crack in the armor that no amount of steel can fix. And as the convoys push deeper into the mid-Atlantic gap, the exhaustion of the crews becomes the Kriegsmarine's greatest ally, setting the stage for a night where the hunters finally become the prey. The breaking point comes on a Tuesday night in the heart of the mid-Atlantic gap, during a screaming gale that turns the ocean into a landscape of moving mountains. This is the night of convoy HX-258, a fleet of 64 merchant ships carrying the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, fuel, food, and the very shells meant to liberate Europe. Protecting them is a ragged screen of 5 destroyers, their hulls battered by weeks of continuous combat, and their crews hollowed out by the exhaustion we've just witnessed. In our history, the Black Pit of the Atlantic was closed by long-range bombers and improved radar. But in this timeline, the Kriegsmarine has achieved a terrifying tactical evolution. They have realized that the Allied destroyers, once the apex predators of the surface, are now blinded by their own fatigue and the failure of their electronic ears. The U-boats no longer creep toward the convoy at 3 knots, submerged and silent. They have become surface raiders. On the bridge of the lead destroyer, the captain's eyes are bloodshot, fixed on a radar scope that is flickering with the snow of German electronic interference. Suddenly, the darkness is shattered. A magnesium flare bursts overhead, turning the midnight sea into a blinding, sterile white. But the flare didn't come from a sister ship. It came from the horizon. The U-boats have surfaced. In the engine rooms of the tin cans, the vibration changes. The order for flank speed comes down, but the destroyers are trapped in a lethal paradox. To catch the surfaced U-boats, they must go fast, but the faster they go, the louder their propellers scream, and the more certain it is that an acoustic T5 torpedo will find their rudders. The hunters are forced to move at a crawl, while the U-boats, low-slung and nearly invisible in the trough of the waves, use their superior surface speed to outflank the escort line. In the sonar shack, the operator's headset begins to whine. The steady, rhythmic ping of the ASDIC has transformed into a frantic, high-pitched staccato. Ping, ping, ping. It is the sound of a closing distance that defies logic. The operator screams into his headset, but his voice is drowned out by the first explosion. It isn't a merchant ship that dies first. It's the destroyer on the starboard flank. A single Zonkonig, attracted by the frantic churning of the ship's twin screws, strikes the stern. The explosion doesn't just sink the ship. It disintegrates the aft section, sending the depth charge racks into the air. For a few horrifying seconds, the destroyer is a torch, illuminating the very nightmare it was meant to prevent. In the glow of the burning escort, the crew of the lead ship sees them, the sleek, wet backs of 3 U-boats running on the surface, barely 500 yards away. They are already past the screen. They are inside the perimeter. The chaos is absolute. The destroyers begin firing blindly into the dark, their 5-inch guns barking at shadows, but the muzzle flashes only serve to ruin their night vision further. Tracers crisscross the sky in a frantic, aimless web. On the bridge, the realization hits like a physical blow to the stomach. The 1/4-inch shield hasn't just been dented, it has been bypassed entirely. The screen has been breached. The wolves are no longer at the door. They are in the house, and the thin-skinned protectors can only watch as the slaughter begins. In this moment, the pride of the fleet feels less like a warship and more like a witness to an execution. The tactical math of the Atlantic has shifted, and the cost of that shift is written in the lives of men who realized too late that their armor was never meant to stop a predator that had learned to run. To understand the carnage unfolding in the Atlantic, you have to understand the fundamental lie of the destroyer's construction. In the popular imagination, a warship is a floating fortress, a mountain of steel capable of shrugging off everything but the heaviest shells. But for the destroyer, the tin can of the fleet, that image was a deadly myth. In the real-world engineering of the 1940s, naval design was a zero-sum game of weight. Every ton of armor plating added to a hull meant a ton of machinery or fuel that had to be left behind. To achieve the 35 knots required to hunt submarines or screen a carrier, the destroyer had to be stripped bare. Its armor wasn't steel, it was speed. The hull was composed of high-tensile steel, but it was rarely thicker than 3/4 of an inch at its most robust points. In many critical sections, especially along the hull's midsection, it was barely a 1/4 inch thick, hardly enough to stop a heavy machine gun bullet, let alone a naval shell. In our history, this gamble worked because destroyers were rarely the primary targets of heavy surface fire. They were protected by the sheer numbers of the escort screen and the long-range support of battleships. But in this darkened timeline, where the Axis has perfected the acoustic hunt, that safety has evaporated. The destroyer is no longer a hunter hidden in the mist. It is a glaring, noisy target with the skin of a soda can. Imagine the horror on the bridge as a surfaced U-boat, emboldened by its new technological edge, closes the distance in the dark. In this reality, the Kriegsmarine doesn't always waste a precious torpedo on a crippled escort. They use their 20mm and 37mm flak cannons. In any other naval engagement, these are anti-aircraft tools, annoyances to be ignored by larger ships. But against a destroyer's unarmored hull, they are ship killers. The visual is haunting. A burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds catches the hull at the waterline, and the thin steel doesn't just dent, it unzips. The ship is literally zippered open by a rhythmic stream of fire. Because there is no internal armor, those rounds don't stop at the outer skin. They punch through both sides of the ship, passing through the mess decks, shredding high-pressure steam lines, and igniting the thin-walled depth charges still sitting in their racks. A single, well-placed burst of light cannon fire can cause catastrophic flooding that the pumps, already struggling with the ship's vibration, simply cannot handle. The tin can is failing. The myth of the unsinkable escort is bleeding out into the freezing brine of the North Atlantic, one jagged hole at a time. The men on these ships are beginning to realize they aren't sailing in weapons of war. They are trapped in floating coffins that offer the illusion of protection while providing none. But as the Atlantic bridge begins to buckle under the weight of this new acoustic nightmare, an even darker shadow is stretching across the globe. While the sailors of the Atlantic are learning to fear the sound of their own engines, their brothers in the Pacific are about to encounter a different kind of terror. If the Atlantic was a battle of noise and desperation, the Pacific is becoming a theater of silence and invisible death. There, the Imperial Japanese Navy is preparing to unveil a weapon that makes the German acoustic torpedo look like a toy. A weapon that will turn the vast, moonlit reaches of the Solomon Islands into a graveyard of ships that never even saw the enemy coming. The Atlantic was a choir of screaming sonar and groaning steel. The Pacific? The Pacific is a tomb of silence. While the U-boats in the West rely on the noise of a destroyer's engines to find their mark, the Imperial Japanese Navy has mastered the art of the invisible strike. In this timeline, the IJN didn't just possess the best night-fighting optics in the world, they integrated them into a doctrine of total nocturnal dominance that leaves the Allied fleet blind and bleeding in the dark. Imagine standing on the wing of the bridge of a Fletcher-class destroyer, patrolling the narrow, humid corridors of the Solomon Islands. The air is thick enough to chew, and the darkness is absolute. You trust your radar, but in this reality, the tropical clutter and the jagged volcanic coastlines turn the screen into a mess of ghosts. You look out into the blackness through standard-issue binoculars, seeing nothing but the occasional whitecap. But 2 miles away, hidden by the curve of the earth in the shroud of night, a Japanese lookout is perched in a crow's nest. He isn't using radar. He is using cat's eye optics, massive tripod-mounted binoculars with light-gathering capabilities that defy belief. To him, your silhouette is a stark, gray ghost against the horizon. He doesn't need a ping to find you. He only needs to wait. Then comes the long lance. In our history, the Type 93 oxygen torpedo was already a miracle of lethal engineering. It was faster, carried a heavier warhead, and traveled further than anything in the Allied arsenal. But its most terrifying trait was its wink. Because it burned pure oxygen instead of compressed air, it left no trail of bubbles, no telltale white line on the surface to warn a lookout, no chance for a hard aport maneuver. In this darkened timeline, the IJN has mass-produced an even more stable variant, deployed in numbers that saturate the ocean. The horror of the long lance horizon is its suddenness. There is no tension of a closing submarine, no frantic depth charge patterns. There is only the peace of the night, followed by an explosion so violent it feels like the world has cracked open. A half-ton of high explosive hits that quarter-inch steel hull at 48 knots. Because there is no wake, the first sign of an attack is the ship next to you in the column suddenly erupting into a pillar of orange flame 300 feet high. One moment, the ship is cutting through the swell. The next, its entire bow has been severed, the forward magazine ignited by a weapon that was launched 6 miles away. There is no enemy in sight. No gun flashes on the horizon, no planes overhead. Just the sound of rushing water and the screams of men being swallowed by the sea. This is the psychological rot of the Pacific theater. In the Atlantic, you could at least fight the sound. In the Pacific, you are fighting a ghost. the destroyer crews begin to suffer from a new kind of paralysis. They stop looking at their instruments and start staring into the black until their eyes ache, waiting for a phantom that gives no warning. The tin can is no longer a shield. It is a target in a shooting gallery where the marksman is invisible. And as the Allied command scrambles to find a counter to this silent death, they turn to technology to save them. But in this timeline, even the machines are beginning to lie. On the bridge of a Fletcher-class destroyer, the atmosphere is no longer one of professional alertness. It is a tomb of green light and static. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and the frantic, rhythmic clicking of the SG radar set. For months, these glowing screens were the sailors' only solace. The magic eye that could see through the tropical squalls and the moonless Pacific nights. But in this darkened timeline, the magic has curdled. The Axis powers have perfected their countermeasure, a relentless wave of electronic noise and chaff that turns the radarscope into a blizzard of false echoes. The radar operator, a boy barely 19 with eyes bloodshot from staring at the phosphorus glow, wipes sweat from his forehead. "I've got ghosting at 090, he whispers, his voice cracking. "Multiple contacts. No. Wait. It's gone. It's just snow." Behind him, the captain stands like a statue, his hands gripped so tightly around the railing that his knuckles are bone white. He knows that in the seconds it takes for the radar to clear, a long lance could already be mid-run. The high-tech advantage that defined the early war has evaporated, replaced by a sensory deprivation trap that leaves the crew more vulnerable than if they had no radar at all. This is the transition from the digital to the primal. When the screens fail, the order is given, "Eyes outside!" Officers and lookouts rush to the bridge wings, pressing their faces against the cold steel of their binoculars. But the transition is jarring. After hours of relying on the green glow of the radar, the natural world looks like a void. The ocean is a shifting tapestry of grays and blacks, where every cresting wave looks like the wake of a periscope, and every cloud shadow looks like the silhouette of a heavy cruiser. The tension is a physical weight, pressing down on the lungs of every man on the bridge. They are blind, deaf, and screaming inside. Then, the Blue Ghost incident occurs, the inevitable result of a command structure shattered by paranoia. It begins with a flicker on the horizon, a momentary flash of light that shouldn't be there. Is it a signal lamp? A muzzle flash? The captain of the USS Bancroft doesn't wait to find out. His ship has seen 3 destroyers in its division vaporized by unseen enemies in the last week. He cannot afford to be second. "Main battery! Target designated! Fire!" The 5-inch guns roar, tearing through the silence of the night. The shells arc into the blackness and find their mark. There is a secondary explosion, a terrifyingly familiar sound of steel being zippered open. But as the star shells illuminate the target, the cheers on the Bancroft turn to ash in their throats. The ship they are raking with fire isn't a Japanese raider. It is the USS Monaghan, their own sister ship, which had suffered a radio failure and drifted 3 miles out of position. In the confusion of the jamming, the Monaghan cannot signal her identity. She fires back in a desperate act of self-defense, believing she has stumbled upon an IJN ambush. For 20 minutes, 2 American destroyers engage in a knife fight in the dark, pouring high explosives into each other's unarmored hulls. By the time the error is realized, the Monaghan is settling into the abyss, and the Bancroft is a floating wreck, her bridge a charnel house of friendly fire. This is the ultimate victory of the Axis electronic warfare. They didn't need to sink every ship themselves. They only needed to break the bond of trust between the hunters. The screen has not just been breached, it has turned inward. As the sun rises over a graveyard of American steel, the realization sets in. The destroyers are no longer a cohesive shield. They are a collection of terrified, isolated islands, waiting for a threat they can no longer see and a command they can no longer trust. And while they look to the horizon for the next ghost, the sky above is beginning to scream with a new, even more desperate terror. The silence following the Bancroft incident doesn't last. It is replaced by a sound that will haunt the dreams of every survivor for the rest of their lives. A high-pitched, rocket-fueled shriek that cuts through the salt air like a physical blade. In our history, the Oka-piloted bomb, a human-guided missile, was a late-war act of desperation deployed in 1945 when the Japanese Empire was already gasping its last breath. But in this dark timeline, the thunder gods of the Special Attack Corps are perfected and mass-produced by the summer of 1943. The Imperial Japanese Navy realizes a brutal mathematical truth. They don't need to sink the American carriers with traditional dogfights. They only need to strip away the tin cans that protect them. The strategy shifts from naval engagement to systematic extermination. The primary target is no longer the flight deck. It is the destroyer. For the men on the picket line, life becomes a countdown. The picket line is a ring of destroyers stationed 50 to 100 miles ahead of the main fleet. Their job is to act as an early warning system, using their radar to vector in friendly fighters. But in this reality, being on the picket line is a death sentence. You are a solitary dot on a vast blue map, a thin-skinned target with no one to hide behind. The experience of an Oka attack is unlike anything else in naval history. On the deck of a Fletcher-class destroyer, the anti-aircraft crews squint into the sun, their hands slick with sweat on the grips of the 40mm Bofors. Then they see it. A Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber hovering at the edge of the horizon. It looks slow, ponderous. But then, a small, sleek shape detaches from its belly. 3 rocket motors ignite. The Oka isn't a plane. It's a 2,600-pound warhead with wings and a pilot who has already said his final prayers. It accelerates to over 600 miles per hour, speeds the ship's analog fire control computers were never designed to track. The AA gunners fire until the barrels of their guns glow cherry red. They see their tracers tearing into the fuselage of the approaching missile. They see the cockpit shatter. But it doesn't matter. The Oka doesn't veer off. It doesn't flinch. You cannot scare a weapon that has already accepted its own destruction. Even if the pilot is killed instantly, the terrifying momentum of the rocket carries the mass of steel and high explosives forward, a literal bolt of lightning aimed directly at the destroyer's thin hull. There is a specific, soul-crushing helplessness in watching a weapon that doesn't care if it dies. The crews realize that their skill, their bravery, and their training are being weighed against a force that has abandoned the concept of survival entirely. When an Oka strikes, it doesn't just damage the ship, it vaporizes it. The quarter-inch steel of the hull, offers no more resistance than wet paper. By late 1943, the Pacific has become a graveyard of masts. The picket line is renamed by the sailors as the Suicide Circle. This marks the beginning of the abandonment phase of the war. Morale doesn't just dip, it vanishes. The men on the destroyers begin to realize that they aren't being sent out to fight a war, they are being sent out to be consumed. The destroyer is no longer a hunter. It is a lightning rod, designed to attract the fire that would otherwise hit the important ships. As the losses mount to levels that the American public is not yet being told, a cold, hard shift occurs within the Naval High Command. The tin can is no longer viewed as a vessel of war. It is being reclassified in the minds of the admirals as something much more cynical. The era of the escort is over. The era of the expendable shield has begun. The math of naval warfare has shifted from a strategic challenge to a ledger of extinction. By early 1944, the statistics reaching the Navy Department in Washington are catastrophic. For every Axis submarine sunk or Oka missile intercepted, the Allied fleet is losing 4 destroyers. It isn't a war of attrition, it is a slaughter. The workhorses of the fleet are being sent to the glue factory at a rate that threatens to leave the heavy hitters, the carriers and the battleships, completely exposed. But in this darker timeline, the response from High Command isn't to withdraw or rethink, it is to double down on the carnage. In the Mahogany Row offices of Pearl Harbor, a new doctrine is whispered into existence. It isn't found in the public manuals, but it's written in the private memos of the Joint Chiefs. The destroyer is no longer classified as a combat vessel intended to survive an engagement. It is officially redesignated as ablative shielding. In the cold language of thermodynamics, an ablative shield is a layer designed to be burned away, to melt and vaporize so that the core remains intact. The core, in this case, is the battleship. When the orders are inevitably leaked, a radioed transcript intercepted by a panicked ensign, a discarded memo found in a trash bin at a refueling station, the effect on the crews is like a physical blow. The tin can sailors realize that their purpose has been stripped of its dignity. They aren't there to hunt. They are there to die so that the big guns don't have to. A simmering, toxic resentment begins to boil beneath the decks of every Fletcher and Sumner-class ship in the Pacific. On the battleships, officers dine on porcelain plates behind 12 inches of Krupp-cemented armor, protected by the very men they have deemed expendable. On the destroyers, the men look at their quarter-inch steel hulls and see not a ship, but a coffin, pre-selected by their own admiralty. They are the meat shield, the sacrificial lambs of a desperate command structure that has run out of ideas and is now simply spending lives like loose change. The psychological distance between the small boys and the main body of the fleet becomes a chasm. The destroyer crews stop saluting the capital ships. They stop believing in the total victory promised by the radio broadcasts. They know the truth. The next time the radar pings, they won't be told to maneuver for a counterattack. They will be told to interpose, to place their unarmored hulls directly in the path of the incoming steel. This tension reaches its breaking point in the Philippine Sea, as the fleet prepares for what will become the most desperate naval stand in history. The destroyers are pushed further and further out into the dark, left to drift on the periphery without air cover or support. They are the tripwire. They are the sensors. And as the horizon begins to glow with the silhouettes of the Imperial Japanese Navy's heavy center force, the men on the tin cans realize the ablative doctrine is about to be put to its ultimate, bloody test. They are alone, they are outgunned, and for the first time in the war, they are fighting not just for their country, but in spite of it. The morning of October 25th doesn't bring the sun. It brings the silhouettes of mountains moving across the water. Off the coast of Samar, the horizon isn't a line, it's a firing squad. In this timeline, the miracle of the Philippine Sea never happens. The heavy cruisers that should have been there to bolster the line were lured away by a Japanese decoy force that actually worked. And the air cover, the planes that were supposed to harass the enemy into retreat, were swatted from the sky hours ago by the advanced Axis anti-air suites. What remains is a lone division of destroyers, the small boys, standing between the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force and the defenseless landing craft in the bay. Leading the charge is the Yamato, a monstrosity of steel so vast it creates its own weather system of soot and spray. Its 18.1-inch guns are leveled at the horizon. Against this, the American destroyers have nothing but their speed, their smoke, and their quarter-inch steel skins. The order comes through the bridge speakers, cold and crackling, stripped of any heroic pretense. All units, deploy smoke, close range, interpose. It is the ablative doctrine in its purest, most horrific form. The destroyers turn, not to win, but to be destroyed in a specific order. They churn the sea into a frothing wake, leaning into the turn until the deck plates groan. They are charging into the teeth of the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled, and they are doing it with the full knowledge that they are nothing more than speed bumps. Then, the Yamato fires. An 18-inch shell is not a bullet. It is a 3,000-pound cylinder of hardened steel traveling at twice the speed of sound. When it misses, the sheer displacement of air feels like a physical punch to every man on deck. When it hits, the physics of the tin can surrender instantly. In this dark reality, the luck of Samar has run out. There is no confusion in the Japanese line. The Japanese gunners, aided by the superior night-fighting optics they perfected early in the war, find their mark with terrifying precision. One shell strikes a Fletcher-class destroyer midships. It doesn't explode, not at first. It is moving so fast and the destroyer's hull is so thin that the shell passes through the entire ship like a needle through a paper curtain. It enters the port side, smashes through the fire room, obliterates the main turbines, and exits the starboard side before the fuse can even arm. But the damage isn't just a hole. The kinetic energy alone ripples through the quarter-inch steel like a pebble dropped in a pond, shattering welds and popping rivets like machine gun fire. The ship doesn't just take on water, it loses its structural integrity. It begins to fold in on itself. Men are thrown into the red-hot machinery. The high-pressure steam lines, already strained to the limit, burst, cooking crews alive in the darkness of the engine rooms. On the bridge, the officers don't even have time to scream before the next salvo arrives. This time, high explosive. The ocean isn't just swallowing ships, it's swallowing an entire class of sailor. The Ghost Fleet earns its name in minutes. One by one, the tin cans are zippered open by 8-inch cruiser fire and finished off by the primary batteries of the battleships. They bought the transport fleet 20 minutes. 20 minutes of life purchased with 1,000 souls. As the last destroyer, its hull twisted into a shape no longer recognizable as a vessel, begins its final slide into the abyss, the water around it isn't blue. It's a toxic slurry of oil, blood, and the debris of 1,000 shattered lives. The survivors bobbing in the oil-slicked waves look up, not for rescue, but for the next shadow to pass over them. They have been used, spent, and discarded by a command structure that valued the steel of the battleships over the flesh of the men who protected them. The sacrifice is complete, but the nightmare is only beginning. For those who survived the initial impact, the real horror isn't the Japanese fleet. It's what happens when the adrenaline fades and the reality of their floating coffin sets in. For the lucky few who aren't consigned to the deep, the nightmare simply changes shape. It moves from the open, terrifying expanse of the sea into the suffocating, blood-slicked confines of the ship's interior. On a destroyer, there is no behind the lines. When the hull is breached, every square inch of the vessel becomes the front line, and nowhere is this more horrific than in the makeshift infirmary. Imagine a space no larger than a modest walk-in closet. This is the official sickbay, designed to handle a few cases of flu or a broken limb. But in this dark reality, where Axis weaponry has evolved to shred steel like parchment, the sickbay is a joke. The overflow spills into the mess deck, the heart of the ship's social life, now transformed into a triage ward of the damned. The ratio is a death sentence in itself: 1 doctor and 2 pharmacy mates for a crew of 300. In our timeline, they were heroes. In this timeline, they are gods of a very small, very dark underworld. They aren't just treating wounds. They are performing industrial-scale salvage on human bodies. There are no sterile theaters here. Surgery is performed on the same bolted-down Formica tables where the crew played cards and drank bitter coffee just hours before. The lighting is the sickly, rhythmic orange of the emergency circuits, flickering every time a shell detonates in the water nearby. And the ship never stops moving. A destroyer is a restless, violent creature. Even in moderate seas, it rolls 30 degrees to either side. Imagine holding a scalpel while the floor beneath you vanishes, then slams back up with the force of a falling elevator. The corpsmen aren't just assisting with bandages. They are acting as human anchors, literally pinning the doctor to the bulkhead so he doesn't slip and sever a patient's carotid artery with a stray movement. They work in a haze of diesel fumes and the copper tang of blood, their boots sliding on a floor that is permanently slick. But it's the sound that truly breaks the spirit. The tin can earns its name in the most haunting way possible during these moments. When Axis secondary batteries or anti-aircraft fire rake the ship, the shrapnel doesn't always pierce the hull. Often, it just peppers it. To the men trapped below the waterline, it sounds like 1,000 hammers striking a metal drum. It sounds like heavy rain on a corrugated tin roof. But this rain is made of white-hot, jagged steel. Each ping against the quarter-inch hull is a reminder of how thin the margin of survival really is. It is the sound of the abyss knocking, asking to come in. The psychological toll is absolute. This is where the destroyer stare turns into a permanent fracture of the soul. There is no escape from the screams of the dying, and no way to drown out the smell of scorched flesh and hydraulic fluid. The men, waiting their turn on the table, watch the blood of their bunkmates drain into the scuppers, mixing with the seawater leaking through the strange rivets. They are at the breaking point. The constant vibration of the overstressed engines, the pounding of the waves, and the relentless ting, ting, ting of shrapnel create a symphony of madness. In this timeline, the thin-skinned shield is no longer a protection, it is a resonator for agony. As the casualties mount and the medical supplies dwindle to nothing but morphine and prayer, a grim realization settles over the fleet. The tin cans are being spent like cheap currency in a game where the exchange rate is stacked against them. They are no longer fighting vessels. They are floating infirmaries, struggling to stay upright long enough to deliver their dying cargo to a shore that is becoming increasingly unreachable. By the autumn of 1944, the unreachable shore is no longer a metaphor. It is a strategic reality. The Atlantic Bridge, that invisible, vital artery of steel and oil connecting the factories of America to the front lines of Europe, has finally snapped. In this dark timeline, the math of naval warfare has reached its terminal conclusion. For every destroyer the Allies launch, the Axis acoustic nightmare and the perfected night-fighting tactics of the IJN claim 4 more. The tin cans are being sent to the bottom faster than the welds can cool on the slipways of Quincy or Glasgow. And with the screen gone, the merchant fleet, the slow, lumbering lifeblood of the war effort, is left naked. The geopolitical consequences are swift and devastating. Without the protective shield of the destroyers, the U-boat wolf packs move from hunting to harvesting. In the span of 3 months, 90% of the grain and fuel shipments destined for the United Kingdom are sent to the seabed. The Atlantic Bridge isn't just broken. It is a graveyard of rusted hulls and wasted potential. This leads to the starvation winter of 1944. Imagine a London not of defiant blitz spirit, but of hollow-eyed silence. There is no coal for heat, no flour for bread, and no fuel for the few Spitfires left to guard the skies. The British Isles, once the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Allied cause, have been effectively neutralized, not by a grand invasion, but by the systematic erasure of the small, thin-skinned ships that were supposed to keep the lanes open. In this world, the destroyer is no longer a symbol of naval utility or escort duty. It has become a chilling emblem of a failing global order. Every time a destroyer is zippered open by a torpedo or pulverized by a long lance, a piece of the post-war world dies with it. The high commands in Washington and London realized too late that they gambled the fate of Western civilization on a ship with a 1/4 inch of steel for a skin, and they lost. The dark decision to use these ships as ablative shielding for battleships backfires spectacularly. When the destroyers are gone, the battleships are nothing more than prestigious targets, trapped in harbors they cannot leave. The war doesn't end with a heroic push into Germany or landing on the Japanese mainland. It ends with a slow, agonizing retreat into isolationism as the oceans become impassable barriers once again. The sight of a destroyer's silhouette on the horizon no longer brings hope to a merchant sailor. It brings dread. It is the sight of a target, a lightning rod for an invisible enemy that cannot be stopped. The tin can sailors who remain are the ghosts of a lost cause, patrolling a sea that they no longer own, waiting for the ping that signals the end. This is the abyss. This is the world where the shield failed, where the thin margin of steel was not enough to hold back the tide of a technological nightmare. We see a world where the courage of 300 men in an iron sweatbox wasn't enough to save 1 billion people from a century of darkness. But as we look at this map of a broken Atlantic and a starving Europe, we have to step back from the edge of the what if. We have to look away from the smoke and the wreckage of a timeline that never came to pass. Because to understand the true weight of the tin can legacy, we must contrast this nightmare with the staggering, incredible reality of what actually happened. The darkness we've just navigated is a haunting shadow of what could have been. But as we pull back the curtain of the what if, we find ourselves standing on the solid ground of a much different, much more inspiring reality. In our world, the tin can was not a floating coffin. It was the backbone of a global victory. The quarter-inch shield did not fail. Instead, it was reinforced by something far stronger than steel, the sheer, unyielding grit of the men who manned the guns. Shift your perspective from the nightmare of 1944 to the actual history of that year. The Axis technological breakthroughs we imagined, the perfected acoustic torpedoes, and the invincible long lances were real threats, but they were met with a level of Allied ingenuity and industrial might that the dark timeline ignores. When the Kriegsmarine deployed the T-5 Zonkönig acoustic torpedo, the Allies didn't simply watch their destroyers sink in silence. Within days, they deployed the Foxer decoy, a simple pair of clanging iron bars towed behind the ship that screamed louder than the engines, leading the smart torpedoes harmlessly into the empty wake. The hunters remained the hunters. In the Pacific, the story of the tin can sailors reached its zenith not in a massacre, but in a display of defiance that remains legendary in naval history. At the Battle off Samar, the very scenario we hypothesized, a small group of destroyers facing the main Japanese battle fleet, actually occurred. But the result wasn't the collapse of the Allied line. It was the birth of a legend. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston didn't wait for orders to sacrifice his ship. He didn't act as a blade of shielding for a retreating fleet. He turned his Fletcher-class destroyer toward the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, and charged into a hail of 18-inch shells. The Johnston, along with the Hole and the Heermann, fought with such ferocity, weaving through splashes and laying down suffocating smoke screens, that the Japanese commanders believed they were facing a much larger force of heavy cruisers. The tin cans didn't just buy time. They broke the will of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force through sheer, terrifying aggression. The reality of life on these ships was indeed a sweatbox of diesel and exhaustion. But the engineering of the Fletcher and Tribal classes was far from fragile. These ships were designed with a level of redundancy and compartmentalization that allowed them to survive damage that would have foundered larger vessels. We have records of destroyers missing 60 feet of their bow, or with their midsections hollowed out by fire, still being towed back to port, their crews refusing to let the sea take them. The starvation winter never came to London. The Atlantic Bridge never broke. Because in our timeline, the Axis could never produce their wonder weapons in the quantities needed to overcome the sheer volume of Allied production and the rapid evolution of radar and sonar. For every destroyer the U-boats managed to sink, American and British shipyards launched 3 more. The tin can sailors weren't ghosts of a lost cause. They were the guardians of a lifeline that remained open until the very end. Thankfully, in our world, the margin between safety and the abyss was held by men who refused to let that quarter-inch of steel be the measure of their worth. The shield held, not because it was thick, but because the hearts of those behind it were unbreakable. As the echoes of our hypothetical nightmare fade, we are left with a chilling realization. History is a series of precarious pivots. Had the Kriegsmarine perfected their acoustic sensors just 6 months earlier, or had the Imperial Japanese Navy prioritized stripping away the screen before engaging the heavy hitters, the map of our world would be unrecognizable. The tin can was never meant to be a fortress. It was a gamble, a calculated wager by high commands who believed that speed, fire control, and the spirit of the crews could compensate for a total lack of armor. In our dark timeline, we saw what happens when that gamble fails, leading to a starvation winter and the collapse of the global order. But as we return to the reality of the present, we must look at the men who occupied those iron sweatboxes with a renewed sense of awe. They lived in a state of constant, vibrating tension that the modern mind can scarcely fathom. They didn't just fight the enemy, they fought the environment. They lived in spaces where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and diesel fuel, where the sound of the hull groaning under the weight of the North Atlantic was a constant reminder of their mortality. They knew that a single 20-millimeter shell or a stray piece of shrapnel could zipper their ship open. They didn't have the luxury of heavy plating or the psychological comfort of standing behind a foot of steel. They fought at the knife's edge, knowing that their only defense was their own vigilance. When we look at a modern destroyer today, vessels like the Arleigh-Burke class or the Type 45, we see technological marvels. They are the most sophisticated warships ever built, capable of tracking 100 targets and striking from over the horizon. But look closer. Beneath the radar-absorbent paint and the Aegis sensors, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. These are still thin-skinned ships. They still rely on a remarkably thin shield of steel to keep the crushing weight of the ocean at bay. In the age of hypersonic missiles and drone swarms, the vulnerability of the destroyer hasn't vanished. It has simply evolved. The margin between a triumphant return to port and a descent into the abyss remains as thin today as it was in 1943. The legacy of the tin can sailors is not found in the rusting wrecks on the floor of the Iron Bottom Sound, but in the very existence of the world as we know it. We owe an unpayable debt to the crews of the Johnston, the Glowworm, and the thousands of nameless escorts that stood between the merchant fleets and total annihilation. They were the thin line that held when the world was on the brink of darkness. They were the expendable screen that refused to be expended. In our thought experiment, we saw the horror of what happens when the shield breaks. We saw the helplessness of a crew watching a torpedo they couldn't outrun. Thankfully, we live in the timeline where the gamble paid off. We live in a world shaped by the courage of men who didn't need thick armor to stand their ground. They proved that the strength of a ship isn't measured by the thickness of its hull, but by the resolve of the souls within it. The tin cans held the line, and because they did, the world stayed afloat.